And we are honored now to be joined by somebody who has absolutely been on the front lines of that battle, literally with the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance. Dr. Pierre Kory is our guest here today on BlazeTV. And Dr. Kory, it's an honor, really, truly, to have you with us, brother.
Hey.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. It's good to be here.
So, Doctor, I got yesterday we did a mini bonus episode called Our Overtime, and we interviewed a woman named Karen Mueller. She is an attorney in the state of Wisconsin. She is representing a man who is being denied ivermectin and early treatment by the hospital there. She won at the Circuit Court of Appeals for him to get the treatment. The hospital appealed. And then the state Supreme Court actually, despite the fact the family said, hey, we'll bring in a separate doctor, we will sign off on any form of liability for the hospital. If there's any kind of reaction, you're totally off the hook. Just let us do something other than just have him just sit here on a ventilator. And the state Supreme Court, by a vote of 4-3, said they'd rather have this guy die potentially than honor this request. I have gotten so many emails like this, cases that didn't go to the Supreme Court in their state, but families wrestling with this all over the country. Is this rare?
No, not at all. I mean, there's an attorney from Buffalo, New York, named Ralph Larigo. I have not been able to keep count with how many cases he has taken to the court to get patients access to ivermectin. I mean, the last count was 15 or 16. He's won the majority. And every case that he's won, the patients have actually made it home. So it's actually a pretty remarkable record. But he's overwhelmed. I mean, he's hiring lawyers, and it's a really unfortunate situation having to go to court. I mean, it's just miserable for everyone involved, and it shouldn't be this way. It shouldn't be this way.
What is the benign, innocent explanation for why a hospital would still want to avoid this, even when it puts them totally off the hook? What is it?
A benign one. I don't know. Maybe they just want to avoid precedent. They don't want to be told how to practice medicine, or they don't want to have outside forces dictating how they practice medicine. But that's not so benign. I mean, I don't know. That's a tough question, Steve. I don't see a benign interest. I think it's ego. It's arrogance. It does not have the patient's welfare as its primary purpose. On a risk-benefit analysis, I mean, ivermectin is one of the safest drugs known to mankind, literally one of the safest. It has reproducible efficacy in all phases of the disease, less so the later on. I mean, it is a little bit of, I wouldn't say it's a Hail Mary, but it's its efficacy is going to be less the later that you use it, but it's not zero. And on a risk-benefit analysis, it should be tried. And to pretend otherwise is really, it's unfair and it's unfortunate.
So just to give you some of my personal background, I was an asthmatic as a kid. So I'm very familiar with respiratory ailments and treatments. I was in and out of hospitals. I had to be admitted into hospitals 2 or 3 different, several occasions when I was little, when things like nebulizer treatments were cutting edge technology and they only did them in ERs and hospitals. So I had to be admitted to get those. And so I have a little personal experience living with respiratory infections and ailments. And I was just stunned to sit here last year and watch as our medical system said there was nothing we could do for a respiratory infection other than go home and isolate for 10 days and then wait to see if you can't breathe. And if you can't, come into the hospital and then maybe you'll end up in the ICU on a ventilator where it's literally a flip of a coin that you'll ever get out. Because apparently we were out of leeches and copper bracelets last year. So we went with that protocol instead. How is that possible in the 21st century? We had nothing else for a respiratory ailment or infection other than that.
It's really absurd. I mean, it really defies credulity. I mean, the idea that we should do supportive care only when there were a lot of promising antivirals, repurposed drugs whose safety profiles we knew, and in a novel pandemic or disease, you're kind of, as a physician, you're mandated to try. I mean, the mortality was so high to say that we're not going to use anything and watch these incredible mortality rates. I mean, Steve, I remember, it's so clear to me what was happening. I mean, they were literally running out of ventilators, running out of ICU rooms because doing nothing wasn't working. It was so clear that doing nothing wasn't working. This supportive care only strategy was absurd. And then doctors started using things. I don't know if you know this, Steve, but I gave Senate testimony in May of 2020 And I basically shouted out to the world that you needed to use corticosteroids, which I'm sure you know about as
Mm-hmm.
an asthmatic,
Mm-hmm.
that you needed to use it in hospital phase disease of COVID. And I did that at a time when every national and international healthcare agency was saying, do not use corticosteroids in this disease. And we knew it was working. I could probably spend a half an hour how we knew it was working, but I said that and I got criticized and harassed and really accused of really malpractice in a way until 8 weeks later when a randomized controlled trial showed that it was absolutely life-saving and critical to use. And now it's the standard of care. So we on the ground, we know stuff that is used. And I'll tell you, I've gone through like this metamorphosis because as a physician I was kind of trained that there's nothing really specific that you can use against a virus. We have like valcyclovir for herpes simplex and then ganciclovir for another virus called CMV, but very few antivirals. Now where we sit a year and a half later, we have at least 24 compounds that we know are effective, many of them safe, almost all of them repurposed. And many doctors were using that around the world, but in this country, like you pointed out, Steve, it was like literally go home until you turn blue, then come back to the hospital. And even in the hospital, they weren't trying stuff. It's absurd. It's absurd. It's not what being a physician means.
We're talking to Dr. Pierre Kory. He's with the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance. Add this, we've given you so many resources over the last few days on the show for early treatment, particularly for those of us living in the north as the seasonal wintry wave now begins to head our way. All right, so COVID19criticalcare.com is the website. COVID19criticalcare.com. They even have a PDF, by the way, if you are a physician or you just want to take something to your physician, a full-on treatment protocol PDF. I've got it downloaded on the desktop of my laptop here. I've had it for weeks of what they do, what they recommend. There's a lot of great resources here. COVID19criticalcare.com. You've used this phrase a few times, repurposed drugs. Yeah. Explain what that means for us as laymen, and can you give us pre-COVID examples of how these have been utilized in the past?
Oh, sure. So a repurposed drug is a drug that is FDA approved, and it's generally off patent. So it was approved for one indication. And the reason why we use the word repurpose is because so many mechanisms of disease are similar. And the drug's mechanisms, it might work for one disease and it might work for another. And so when you use it for an indication that originally didn't get approval from, it's repurposed. Another word that I use instead of repurposed is nonprofit, because oftentimes it's off patent, right? And so when you repurpose a drug, it's off patent. It tends to be very cheap. And unfortunately, I'm going to talk about some sinister stuff here, Steve, but there's been a decades-long war, not only in this country, in many countries, against repurposed drugs. The business model of the pharmaceutical industry, it really looks at repurposing of drugs as the enemy because it removes the profit margin. And our system is so geared towards for-profit around drugs and the marketing of drugs that repurposed drugs is the enemy. And unfortunately, like you said, you talk about our protocols. Almost everything on our protocols is a repurposed nonprofit drug, and it's one of the reasons why we've gotten attacked so viciously.
So one sinister example be with ivermectin. So Merck wins a Nobel Prize for the hundreds of thousands of lives that ivermectin saved back in 2015 as an antiparasitic. They came out earlier this year with a letter claiming that their own drug that they just won a Nobel Prize for a few years ago is now not safe to be consumed. And then we find out later in that exact same year, they're about to come out with a new early treatment oral drug for COVID-19. Would that be some of the sort of sinister stuff that you were alluding to a moment ago?
Absolutely. If ivermectin received approval for treatment of early COVID, what would happen to their pipeline drug that they're trying to bring, their on-patent drug that they're trying to bring into the market? It would absolutely decimate the market for that drug. And so literally Merck found itself in competition with their former Nobel Prize winning drug, which had lost its patent protection. And so now they sought to destroy it. That statement that they put on their website, it will go in the historical record. It will not age well. It was literally unadulterated lies. Each of the three statements that they put in there were completely and easily provably false statements. And yet agencies around the world we're starting to listen to pharmaceutical companies now. I mean, it's literally absurd what's going on in the world and the country around the treatment of this disease. We're literally taking guidance from pharmaceutical companies.
When this, I did some math on this, Pierre, a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
Just to run this by you. So if you look at the early contract, the U.S. government has a $1.2 billion contract with Merck for, is it I can't pronounce it.
Molnupiravir, yeah.
Yeah. So it's $1.2 billion, okay? I did some math. That's $70 a pill. The previous life-saving drug backed by now over 100 studies, ivermectin, we'll talk more about here in a second. It's the black market because of it's considered contraband is driving the price up. But a month ago, you could get it for 58 cents a pill at GoodRx online with a coupon at Walgreens. All right.
Yep.
That is an 11,970% profit per pill. Pierre, per pill, not per dosage, per individual pill. 11,970% profit increase for Merck per pill by dissing ivermectin as a repurposed drug for this new cutting edge technology that once we get into real time, who knows, we may find, like remdesivir, it doesn't actually work.
Big money and bad behavior. And bad behavior doesn't even really describe what they're doing. I mean, literally, they do not care about the public health or welfare. I mean, pharmaceutical companies, the public health is not their primary purpose. Their primary purpose is to their shareholders and to their profit margin. And we got to stop pretending that it's anything but that. I mean, you're seeing their behaviors playing out with. You can only describe their behaviors in terms of that, right? Is that they're chasing profits and not health, period.
Let's get to the actual treatment stuff now. We discussed this on a meta level. Let's make it personal to everybody listening right now, because I have urged everybody listening to take advantage of these resources. Because to me, I think every American has a choice right now that unless you can die, and tell me if you think this is wrong, by the way, because if it's wrong, I want to be corrected. Because unless you can confirm within this calendar year that you had a confirmed case of COVID in recovery, as I did, I had COVID in May and recovered. Yep. All right. Unless I can confirm I have some level of natural immunity, given what we saw at the seasonal wave in the Sun Belt, how worse it was this year compared to last, what the early indicators are now in the North, right now in America, the first 4 weeks of October, Pierre, we have 69% more COVID cases, 85% more COVID deaths than we had the first 4 weeks of October a year ago. And the winter wave in the densely populated North is just beginning. So I've told our audience that unless you know you can confirm in this calendar year a recovered case of COVID, you basically everyone in your household has a choice. And that is to either get on the installment plan of boosters and boosters forever with these waning efficacy vaccines, or understand options for early treatment. Is that accurate information that I gave my audience in your view as a physician?
100%. I mean, 100%. And you highlighted the fact that our response to this pandemic, I mean, the vaccines we know are not going to, as a sole response to this pandemic, are insufficient. They're not solving the pandemic. We need multiple other strategies, and early treatment is the one that's been largely suppressed. Early treatment works. The one message I want to give your audience is that not only does early treatment work, there's at least 24 compounds. If you look at our treatment protocols, we have any number of agents. And what I want your listeners to understand is, just like you said, as this winter wave comes, be ready. Have a treatment kit in the cupboard. Many public health ministries around the world have used early treatment programs to incredible successes, right? There are some regions of the world where they eradicated COVID with a widespread early treatment and prevention protocol. And so we need to do the same in this country. Unfortunately, our agencies are not guiding us. And that's why myself and my nonprofit and my colleagues, that's why we put together our website. And we're trying to offer guidance of stuff that we know works. And so I think your interest in this and your shout out to your audience to listen and get ready. I mean, they can protect themselves. When you look at our protocol, so all of our protocols are centered around ivermectin, meaning that is a key component of them. But there's really simple stuff that people could use and get ready for. So for instance, there's been a number of trials showing that if you use simple virucidal mouthwashes, so virucidal means it can kill the virus, it can kill SARS-CoV-2, And there's a number of them on the market that they have this special sort of chemical in there that kills the virus. If you use mouth washing 3 times a day with nasal drops of like povidone iodine, that's where all the virus is early on. So when you're in that kind of cold syndrome or flu syndrome that it presents with, all of the viral burden is in the nasal and oral pharynx. And so if you can sort of sanitize that with a virucidal mouthwash or drops, you'll greatly decrease the viral burden and your course of illness will be markedly impacted. The decreases in hospitalization rates in countries that they did these studies where simple sort of what we call oropharyngeal sanitization is just dramatically different. I mean, it's literally saves lives and prevents hospitalization. That's just one component we have on there. And so that's probably the simplest. You don't need a prescription. You don't need a doctor. You just need to know where to get and how to dose it. And it's also inexpensive. And so that's some of the simple stuff that you could do. And then we have a number of other medicines that you can use that are effective in the early phase. And early treatment is the key because you want to avoid hospital and you want to avoid that pulmonary phase that comes later. And so it's really, I want this message to be really positive, is that there are really good treatments. I would say this though, the older you are and the more farther along you are in the disease, the more stuff you need, right? So the older, the sicker you are. So let's say you have a lot of comorbidities, obesity, diabetes are pretty much the chief ones, or you're an older age, or you're older in disease, meaning day 3, 4, and 5, it's so much easier if you start treatment on day 1. I mean, literally, you can sort of turn this around and almost end it within a few days if you start immediately upon first symptoms. Many patients come to me, they've been sick for 4, 5, 6, 7 days, and I have to use combinations of treatments. And so, in many cases, you're going to need a doctor and who's going to have to be aggressive, because the one message that I've learned with COVID is you can't fall behind. I just do not want that pulmonary phase to start. So I'll do everything I can to make sure that the symptoms are lessening and the patients are starting to feel better quickly.
Pierre, how many patients have you personally consulted or treated during the pandemic so far? What'd you say?
So let me divide them into outpatient and inpatient. Outpatient in the hundreds, I would say 1 to 200. And even though I don't have an outpatient practice, I mean, I've just my huge circle and network, and now I'm a little bit of a figure. And so, I mean, ever widening circles of people I know have reached out to me for help. So I've treated outpatients. And then, I'm a lung and ICU specialist. And so I've treated many hundreds in the ICU over the last year and a half.
So you've gotten your hands dirty, proverbially speaking here. I mean, you have, this isn't theoretical. I just want our audience to understand. These aren't theoretical exercises. You have applied the very treatments we're talking about right now. You can personally attest as a physician. One of the more tragic things I saw last year is the decorated Yale doctor and epidemiologist Harvey Risch was on CNN talking about hydroxychloroquine. And the CNN anchor kept throwing at him these new peer-reviewed studies that show it doesn't work. And Risch is like, dude, I don't need studies. I've got patient files. I gave the drug to patients. I saw it work. I don't need somebody's concocted study when I have a patient's record and they didn't sue me for liability as a physician, so I know it works. So that's what I want to know, and our audience wants to know. Have you seen these things work in real time? Because I go on Twitter, there's a study counter study, because everybody's got their agenda. You have seen these things actually work. You've put these things into people's bodies and watched them heal them.
Without question, and the sad thing, let me just say one thing about the studies, though, Steve, because you're absolutely right. For the casual and the non-scientist, non-physician, you can hear one person use their studies to say it doesn't work, and another one says that they do work. For me, though, the preponderance of the studies for both hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin clearly show it's effective. So the studies are there. They just try to be ignored or suppressed or distorted. And so, because it really is a war out there, and it's a war on our health. And again, it's going back to that profit motive and our system. But beyond the studies, yes, of course it works. You can tell it works. One thing that makes an expert is what's called pattern recognition. And especially when you become expert at COVID, I know the pattern. I know the typical sort of syndrome of symptoms and the general rate of resolution, like how fast it gets better. And when you use, for instance, ivermectin, from my first patient, I'll tell you, let me just give the anecdote of my first patient. They were sick for about 10 days. This is way back in, let's say, October. I started using ivermectin in October 2020, a year ago. And they had fevers, they felt unwell, they had a high heart rate. They were going to bed every night with a heart rate of like 110 to 120. treated them with ivermectin on Sunday night. They flushed. They had like some night sweats that night. In the morning, they woke up. Their heart rate was 80. They had no more fevers, and they felt like 100 times better. It was a dramatic response. And that was my first patient. And ever since then, I generally see, especially if I start early, reproducible, consistent sort of lessening of at least one important symptom. If they were having fevers, they effervesce. If they were getting fatigued, they feel a little bit more energy. If they're having some muscle aches and pains, the muscle aches and pains are lessened or they go away. And so you can pretty quickly see a clinical response in your patients. And so it's not subtle. It's actually not subtle at all. And I'll tell you, Steve, this is the other thing. Any doctor out there who puts down ivermectin or says it doesn't work because of this study, that study, there's just one gold standard question. Have you used it in the care of a COVID patient? And if you haven't, if you have no experience, just like you asked the question, that shows that it's really not, it's not a credible opinion then. I mean, I'm telling you, it's not subtle when you use it, how effective it is.
Two questions before we let you go. I want to make these things
Sure.
as very practical and helpful for our audience as possible, okay? Someone is in a hospital right now or has a physician that won't help them right now get this prescription, get the early protocol treatments that they need. What would you suggest they do?
How to get these medicines prescribed, like that are on our protocol?
Correct, yes.
That's another. So the only one would be, first of all, go to our website. The short form is flccc.net. You can see the medicines and approaches. Then you'd want to find a doctor. We don't curate the list. We don't have any conflicts of interest, but there's a button on our website that says get ivermectin. It really is just to list a directory of lots of practices around the country that we know use our protocols, and you can get a telehealth provider. Luckily, telehealth providers are allowed to treat COVID across state lines during this pandemic, and so there's a whole bunch of them. So you can get prescriptions. I would say like a just-in-time prescription. So I would actually get it now, have it in the cupboard, so you don't want to fall ill and then have to chase down a doctor. And I think a lot of these doctors would help you do that. They would pre-prescribe in the event that you get sick. And that's my dream, Steve, is that every household in the country should have in their cupboard, an early treatment kit with any number of the items that we have on there for the worst case scenario. Let's say you are really sick or have comorbidities and you need more than just one agent. You should have them all ready. And so that would be my advice.
Second question then along those lines, you kind of already answered it. Would you suggest basically every household has, like you have, like ibuprofen, aspirin,
Yes,
Benadryl,
absolutely.
all right? Certain things that you just have as a prophylaxis preventative measure that you know at some point you will need, and you change them out every couple of years when they expire, right? But every medicine cabinet has these. Would you suggest every household in this audience has these sorts of prophylaxis items, including ivermectin right now?
100%. I mean, that is exactly, as a physician, that is my advice. Very strong advice. Get ready, be prepared. You don't want this disease to creep up on you unprepared, period. Get ready. There's ways that you can treat it. Have those agents ready for you at your home. Know the doses, and reach out to a doctor. There are doctors out there that will help you do this.
Is there something that you can be told that you have shown is just bad advice, don't follow it?
Yeah, like stay at home, wait till you turn blue. I mean, that's absolutely
Right.
ludicrous. I mean, that's just the worst advice I've ever heard. It just, no, you need to have agency. You need to go after this thing. I would say monitor yourself for symptoms. And I'm going to say this. Here's another important point, Steve, because I've had a couple of people that I know really well who blew off their COVID because they thought it was a cold. I have to say one thing. Any syndrome that acts like a cold right now should be considered COVID until proven otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And even if the test is negative,
And this is what happened to me. I thought
Yeah.
it came around the same time as my normal sinus infection, and it looked like that. And then 3 days later, I'm at a speaking engagement in South Dakota, and suddenly it feels like there's a damn tire iron on my chest and I cannot breathe. And I'm like, that's not an asthma attack. Okay, I don't know what that is. Turns out it was, and suddenly I can't taste, I can't smell. It was COVID. It was not a sinus infection. So I can verify personally what you're talking about.
that's really important, right? Because part of early treatment is you need the diagnosis. And I have seen people make that mistake, and then they're behind the eight ball. They're 4 or 5 days into COVID, and you lost a window of opportunity to treat much more effectively. And so I think everybody should self-monitor, and anything that seems like a cold is coming on, you want to get tested early. And even if the test is negative, because I've even seen negative, I mean, there are false negatives. There's clearly false negatives. You might even want to consider treatment, even in the setting of a negative test. And so,
especially because this stuff, even with the black market driving the prices up, is still relatively inexpensive vis-a-vis the cost of not doing these things or subjecting yourself to the put yourself on a ventilator system, right?
Clearly, absolutely, I totally agree.
100%. Brother, you are doing the Lord's work. I mean, you have saved a lot of lives, and I just can't thank you enough. Thank you for your time. We'd love to have you back, and God bless you. Okay.
Anytime, Steve. Thanks for that.
Thank you. You bet.
Take care.